get going as soon as we can. Welcome to the 4th IAU Medical Conference. My name is Nadeem Khan. I'm the chair of the medical committee for the IAU. The conference today is called Going the Distance, Food and Fluid Intake to Optimize Performance and Minimize Disease. We are here in beautiful Steenbergen at the occasion of the 24-hour World and European Championships. We have had conferences in South Korea, Belarus, Winschoten, and now Steenbergen. We tried to jump between the 24 hours and the 100-kilometer World Championships so that we can get as many people out as possible who are interested in the subject. Ultrarunning is a buzzword in athletics right now. And what does that mean? It means that people are more interested in what ultrarunning is all about. They're more interested in finding out more research about it, and we have seen a little bit of a spike in the number of papers that have been produced on that. For some of you who have friends and family who are not here, are busy with the race itself, we are actually recording this on video, and we'll possibly be putting it on YouTube, so you can access it over there too. We are very, very honored, privileged to have two very, very esteemed researchers amongst ourselves, people who not only research about ultrarunning but sports in general, and have produced tons and tons of paperwork on it. So I'll just give you a brief introduction on the two speakers and call our first speaker up to the podium. We have Dr. Andrew Bosch, who will be talking about the role of carbohydrates and proteins in recovery for training, and I believe Dr. Tamara Butler is going to move on to post-training and racing aspects of it. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Andrew Bosch. He's the professor in the University of Cape Town. He's a Medical Research Council Research Unit for Exercise Science and Sports Medicine. He's engaged in teaching at both graduate and undergraduate levels. Dr. Bosch's research interests are in the fields of carbohydrate supplementation and effect on exercise metabolism. He's a member of the IAU Medical Committee, and he's also a member of the Professional Nutrition for Exercise and Sports. Dr. Andrew Bosch.
Do I need the microphone? Do I not need it? No. Okay, well then, because otherwise if I do use it, then every time we move away it changes, so rather just leave it. If you can't hear me, then just shout and we can switch it on. Well, thank you very much, Nadeem, for the introduction. It was really fun getting here. My impromptu taxi drivers made it for a very amusing, humorous, and fun-filled trip on the journey from the hotel. And I won't go into any details about that right now. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to deal with a couple of slides looking at some carbohydrate-related issues, glucose, glycogen, and so on. Then I'm going to move onto protein and looking at some issues around recovery and maybe issues related to improved performance. Does it really do anything to improve performance and so on? Now, I believe it's quite a mixed audience in terms of some of you are runners, some of you are medical practitioners, there might be one or two scientists, so that's kind of a difficult audience to cater for, as I'm sure as my co-speaker will agree to, so there's a lot of slides, but I think they're all slides that everybody can take away something from. So the people in the scientific and medical field can see the scientific aspects behind the slide, and for the runners, just take the message. If something's looking longer or taller or something than something else, that's what you need to just pay attention to, not to the gory, finer details. Okay, so I'm going to start off then with looking at blood glucose concentrations and what it means to exercise performance. Now, this is something that goes back probably 100 years ago to when the first research was done on this. I just want to start my stopwatch so that I don't go over time. Okay, like any good athlete would do. Okay, so not that I'm any longer a good athlete, but still. Right, so the glucose story and what it means to exercise performance, and for this group, obviously, running performance. The research goes back to the Boston Marathon in around the early 20s. So it's almost 100 years old that we've been looking at this. So there's a lot of data out there. There's thousands and thousands of papers on the role of glucose and such like, and the translation to performance. And the original work was done on the Boston Marathon runners, was done on two fairly famous dogs, Joe and Sally, that were trained to run on the treadmill in the late 20s and early 30s on a motorized treadmill, and some research work was done with them. And then it moved on, and it's been through various phases of predominantly laboratory work and some field work and so on. But it all boils down to a very simple message, and that is that if we have blood glucose concentration over here, and you have your running time, your exercise time over here with more time off to the right, there's two important things. One is that if you ingest carbohydrate, drink glucose or something, during your race, blood glucose stays up quite high, shown where my pointer is now. But look what happens if you're drinking only water during exercise. Your blood glucose gradually starts dropping down. And this precipitous drop-off down here, that starts happening probably about 2 hours or so into prolonged cycling, prolonged running, and so on. And when you get into this kind of level over here, this is probably looking at about 3.5 millimoles is the unit that is used. Around about 3.5 millimoles or so per liter concentration. You're in big trouble if you're trying to run a marathon, or in this case run an ultra and so on. So I could show you all the background information, but that's clearly not what we're here for today. So just take home the message that you need to maintain blood glucose concentration by ingesting carbohydrate during exercise, because if you don't, your blood glucose is going to drop and you're going to be in big trouble. Okay, so if you're going to try and maintain your blood glucose concentration during exercise, how are we going to do that? Well, I suppose it's fairly obvious. You're going to have to ingest some form of carbohydrate while you're running. So the question then becomes, well, what form of carbohydrate? And this was a research question that the exercise and sports physiologists in the 1980s and early 1990s spent a lot of time looking at. We wanted to know, is there one type of carbohydrate that is better than any other type of carbohydrate? So if glucose is good, is maltodextrin better? Is maltose better than that? Is isomaltulose even better? So everybody was in search of that holy grail of carbohydrate, the magic bullet that was going to give the advantage. And unfortunately, all that was found was that they were pretty much the same. So this over here is what I call peak oxidation rate. So that is, if you are ingesting this carbohydrate and we are measuring by various techniques how much of that carbohydrate is getting used by the muscle, the highest value that you would get, that would be the peak rate of oxidation. So how much is it contributing to your energy as you're running? And what is found and repeated throughout the world is this is 1 gram per minute. And you can see that over here, cornstarch, it's a gram a minute. Soluble starch, it's a gram a minute. Glucose polymer, gram a minute. Maltose, pretty much a gram a minute. Glucose, and just about anything else if you wanted to add to that list. Every carbohydrate peaks out at a gram per minute, except poor old fructose down here, which is around about 0.6 to 0.75 or so grams per minute. It's metabolized a little bit differently, and it doesn't get to the muscle nearly as quickly to be able to be used as a fuel. So pretty much the take-home message is it doesn't matter what type of carbohydrate you use in terms of the amount of energy that it's going to deliver to the muscle to keep you fueled during prolonged exercise. So the real difference between any of these and some of the others that I haven't got listed here is just personal preference is one thing. They taste different, and some people would prefer something with a bit of sweetness, some people prefer something that's maybe not so sweet. So for instance, glucose will be pretty sweet. Glucose polymer is the opposite. It's very bland. It's got a kind of no taste. And so if you like that, then that would be the one to go with. The one advantage of the glucose polymer, though, other than, I said there's no advantages, but there is maybe one possible advantage there. And that is that it empties from the stomach a little bit faster than the others. So if you're wanting to drink quite a high concentrated solution of this glucose polymer, you can, and it'll still empty from the stomach, whereas an equal concentration of glucose or one of the others might kind of just sit in the stomach, and when you're running you start feeling it all sloshing around, and that's because it's not emptying. and the glucose polymer maybe empties a little bit better. But by and large, they all deliver the same amount of carbohydrate to the muscle, and the only real advantage or disadvantage is, what does the runner prefer? So most carbohydrates are created equal. I mentioned fructose being down here. There's one instance where fructose comes into its own, and that is when we mix it with something else. So if you take glucose over here, for instance, and you mix it with fructose in a drink, or you mix maybe glucose polymer with fructose, the two combined work very, very well together. And there's been a lot of research done in the last 6 years particularly or so that has shown that in these mixed carbohydrate drinks, where you put a mixture together, the oxidation rate does indeed go much higher than where I'm circulating with this pointer right now, the 1 gram a minute. So it does go higher than that. It goes maybe right up to 1.5, 50% more. So you're thinking there, wow, I've got to do that. Well, maybe not. Because you can oxidize more, but there is no evidence at the moment, or very, very flimsy evidence at best, that it results in improved performance. So it's a lot of schlep to go and mix these mixed carbohydrates together. But does it translate into performance improvement? I'm not convinced that it does. Most of the work has shown that it doesn't. There's one group in Australia that have come out with a paper that I'll say suggests that it might improve performance. But it's not nearly as dramatic as you might think. So if you're thinking, oh, 50% more oxidation is going to result in a lot better performance, well, if there is any improvement in performance, it's so small that you can hardly measure it. So at the moment, my take-home message to you is stick to whatever carbohydrate type the runner tolerates the best. That is the maybe the final say on it, in my opinion, at the moment. If we later find that the mixed carbohydrates do indeed offer a performance advantage, well, then we need to maybe start thinking about that. That's the take-home message, that you must use these mixed drinks. Okay, so that's glucose. What about muscle glycogen? So sure you've all heard in some way or another, you've heard about muscle glycogen, and of course muscle glycogen is absolutely critical to performance. When your muscle glycogen starts dropping down low, that's it, game over sign pops up. You become very heavy in the legs, very tired, very weary feeling in the legs, and you cannot continue at the same pace that you were continuing at before. And in a training perspective, training runs that used to feel easy at a particular speed suddenly become feeling harder. You can't run your time trials and things at the same pace. You can't do your track workouts if you're doing track workouts at the same pace as before. It's a critical fuel to have in the muscle. So muscle glycogen is very important, and I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about muscle glycogen. So for the non-medical people, how do we get the values I'm going to talk about? This is a muscle biopsy. This was a technique that was introduced in the late 1960s, 1967 by Aalborg and his co-workers, and that was a real fun time, I guess, for the physiologists of the day, because you suddenly could get little samples of muscle to work with, and you could measure all kinds of things, muscle glycogen, muscle enzymes, and what have you. So here we have the leg. In this case it's actually a cyclist, and you make a little incision under local anesthetic over here where the pointer is. I don't know how well you can see from the back, but this silver looking thing, that's the biopsy needle itself. You've got mainly two sizes, either 4 or 5 mil diameter, so it's a fairly substantial piece of kit. And that gets inserted through the incision that is made through the skin and the underlying tissue. And if you read really carefully, you might just be able to see a bit of a line over here. That's a clear plastic tube that goes to somebody standing on the side here with a big 50 ml syringe. And then as the needle goes in, you get your little helper on the side here to pull back on the syringe, and that sucks a little bit of extra muscle into the bore of the needle here, and you can make the cut, and pronto you've got a little chunk of muscle to work with. And so you can process that in various ways. Like I said, you can measure glycogen, you can measure enzymes, and you can process it as well to actually show the glycogen in glorious technicolor, and that is what a sample of muscle, full of muscle glycogen, that is now a runner that is followed a carbohydrate loading type diet. There's lots of muscle glycogen in there. Now the same runner taken after 2 hours of running in the lab, the muscle looked like that. Now this guy was actually complaining at the time that he was tired and exhausted and couldn't carry on at the prescribed pace. And I wasn't that keen for him to stop unless he really, really had to, because it was supposed to be a 3-hour experiment, and these people are not easy to find. So when you've managed to locate somebody, you kind of want to see the experiment through to the end. And so if you've got somebody saying, I can't carry on after 2 hours, you can already starting to think, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to go and find another person to replace this now, and so on. So I was busy saying, oh, come on, I'm sure it's okay, it's just in your head. But if you look at the pre and the post, the poor guy really was pretty buggered, I guess. If you look at just these isolated little colored dots, if you do another section that shows the type of muscle it is, fast twitch or slow twitch muscle, in this particular individual, those little islands were all the fast twitch muscle, and so that wasn't really available for what he was doing, which was an endurance run anyway. So this was a tired runner, and this is what you look like a couple of hours into your endurance races. Or if you're training and not ingesting enough carbohydrate, I'll show you a slide just now, where you drive the muscle glycogen down low, and like I said a few moments ago, you can't train at the same level anymore. So speaking more of muscle glycogen, you obviously want to get it as high as possible. And I said that we had these experiments in the late 60s where Orwell, Bergstrom, some of the guys working at that time, developed this technique of the muscle biopsy and using it in sports research. And this is a slide that is a composite of a number of different research studies. But what it shows is a couple of things that are quite interesting. Okay, so over here, where the pointer is now, that's going to be the muscle glycogen concentration, how much muscle glycogen there is in the muscle. And this is time over here that you can exercise for, endurance time. And I'm looking at a low carbohydrate, shown by this sort of off yellow kind of color, mixed carbohydrate, and a high carbohydrate diet. And what was soon apparent was that when the diet is low in carbohydrate, the muscle glycogen is low over here, and your endurance time over here, where I'm pointing with the pointer, the endurance time is low as well. If you go to a mixed carbohydrate diet, so that's over here where I'm circulating with the pointer now, that's about 50 to 60% carbohydrate diet, the muscle glycogen is higher, about 100 over here, and your exercise time to exhaustion is a bit longer. And on the highest carbohydrate diet, about 75 to 85% carbohydrate, the muscle glycogen is at its highest, and exercise time is longer. And you can draw a line through that more or less, which shows a more or less linear relationship between the higher the carbohydrate content in the diet, the higher the muscle glycogen content, and the higher the muscle glycogen content, the longer one can exercise for, be it running, cycling, whatever else, the longer one can exercise for before it becomes impossible to maintain the same pace. So if you're running at 4 minutes a kilometer and with your muscle glycogen intact, as soon as it gets down to a low level, maybe about 20 or 30 millimole per kilogram weight, you can't maintain that pace. It's not going to make you faster in the beginning. It just means that you're going to have difficulty maintaining a particular pace. So obviously, if this is the case, if you've got more carbohydrate, more glycogen, and more glycogen is better performance, it wasn't an unfair question to be asking, how can we optimize, is there some technique we can develop that can optimize how much glycogen can be stored in a muscle before a race? And that is the beginnings of what we all know as the carbohydrate loading diets. Okay, so now there's going to be a couple of graphs with lots of lines on them. Just ignore them and just follow the lines that I'm talking about. Okay, so this is one of the earliest experiments. And what it was looking at was to find a technique that could optimize muscle glycogen storage. And these lines A, B, and C here, they are different techniques that the researchers were trying out to try and increase muscle glycogen stores. And I'm going to just concentrate on line A because that's the important one. And that's what became known as the carbo loading diet. And what it is muscle glycogen starts off down here at about 80 or so. And at that time, they're given a bout of exercise to do, lowers the muscle glycogen from the normal, from around 80 down to probably about 30 or 40. So now these people have got low muscle glycogen concentrations. And for 3 days, that stays down low. And stays down low by a diet that is low in carbohydrate, with maybe a bit of exercise thrown in. Then at this point over here, these people are given a high carbohydrate diet, as you do after 3 days of your depletion phase in a carbo loading diet. And if you follow line A, up goes the muscle glycogen to very high levels over here, move across to around about 200 millimole per kilogram weight. So that's typically what you'd expect to find in a carbohydrate-loaded muscle. And like I said, that became known as the diet that every endurance athlete followed to carbo load. Depleting for 3 days, followed by 3 or 4 days of a high carbohydrate intake. For some reason, in athletic circles, it became 3 days of a high carbohydrate diet, but you can see how the highest values were only reached after 6 or 7 days, actually in the experimental work. Now, there was a serious flaw in this study that was not appreciated at the time that it was done. And that is that the people in the study were very, very untrained. They were actually Swedish firemen. So they were bordering on sedentary. Now, those of you who are running the 24-hour race, you are very different to those Swedish firemen. Your muscle has changed as a result of your training. And some of those changes that have taken place are changes to the enzymes that store glycogen in the muscle. So you don't behave like this. So if you look back here, where I showed you the start of this line over here, if you look where the red dot is now, that's around about 80 or so millimole per kilogram wet weight as the unit of measurement. Now, under normal circumstances, those of you who are the runners in the audience, if we did a biopsy on one of you, even without carbohydrate loading, your muscle wouldn't be sitting down at 80, it'd be sitting at about 120. And that is because when you train, you change some of the enzymes in the muscle, and one of the key ones for those who want to know is glycogen synthase. Your glycogen synthase is made very active. And so as a result of that, your muscle stores more glycogen than in these sedentary type people. So those of you who are sedentary, you'll be sitting at about 80. So your muscle behaves differently when you train. And that was recognized in an experiment by Mark Sherman in 1981. So here we have the depletion over here again. These were trained people, so the value starts higher and it drops down. And if you look at where my pointer is, don't look at the rest of the slide just yet. This is the carbo loading diet that I've just described. A low percentage carbohydrate where my pointer is right now. And at this point, the high carbohydrate, and up goes the muscle glycogen. That's what I've just shown you. Depletion, low carb, high carb. But look what happens if there's no depletion in diet for 3 days. Over here, 50% carbohydrate. They go from this value, just on their normal diet, and the glycogen's already going up. And then they switch to a high concentration diet, carbohydrate diet, 75%, and it goes right up to 200 millimoles. So what's the take-home message on that? Take-home message is that if you're a trained person, you don't need to go through that depletion phase. Simply by ingesting a high carbohydrate diet without any depletion, you will increase your muscle glycogen stores. So you don't need to go through the whole rigor of eating high protein, fat, and low carb. And that, of course, is a good thing, because then you don't have to change your diet just prior to a race. But there's another flaw in this study, and that is over here. They still depleted the people. So they started at the 120, and they had them run 21 kilometers, which brought their muscle glycogen down. So they went from this low value, 50, up to the high value of 75, the high value diet of 75% carbs, to a total of 200 millimole up here, but from a low starting point down here. And nobody should be, if they are eating properly and training properly, nobody should have 50 millimole as their starting glycogen concentration. You should be sitting at least around about 120. So what happens if you take somebody who is well trained and is following a proper normal training diet, and they want to use that as their starting point to carbohydrate load? We'll see in a moment. Let's just add one thing to that, and that is, if you're going to run a race, it's a no-brainer. You're going to cut back on your training anyway, right? You're going to be tapering in some way as a separate thing anyway. So what you've got is you're a trained athlete, so you've got a muscle that's got all the training adaptations going on. You're eating a diet that you should be eating of fairly high in carbohydrate as your normal training diet, so you'll be sitting at around about 120 on the scale. And now you're going to cut back before your race. What happens to your muscle glycogen? How do you carb load? Well, very simply, if you start at around 120 within certainly 48 hours, eating a very high 80% carbohydrate diet, you can hit very close to 200 millimole. So that's the final modification at the moment. I don't know if there's going to be a full farm later, but at the moment, the take-home message is if you wanted to hit really high muscle glycogen concentrations, if you're doing all the things that I've just been speaking about, to reach the very highest concentrations of muscle glycogen, cut back on your training, eat a 75 to 80% carbohydrate diet, and your muscle glycogen is going to go right up to the highest levels that we can get of around about 200 millimoles. As simple as that. I have a little slight variation in the theme that I like to add. I feel that all that extra carbohydrate that you're eating at that time does sometimes interfere with the gastrointestinal system, and maybe you're going to have to pit stop during the race as a result or something like that. So I like the runners that I'm working with to carb load. Let's just say a race starts on the Saturday. I like them to carb load Wednesday and Thursday, as I've just shown you now, and then on the Friday they eat their normal diet, and then they race on the Saturday. The glycogen is going to go nowhere on the Friday if they're not carb loading. It's like filling up your car with petrol before a long trip and then deciding to quickly go down to the corner store and buy some milk or something. The amount of petrol that you're going to use for that little trip down the road and back is going to do nothing. It's not going to affect when your petrol is going to run out. So if you have a marathon runner carb loaded and on the Friday they don't carb load and they go for a 20-minute jog and do some strides or whatever, the amount of muscle glycogen used in that activity is not going to influence when they're going to get into trouble in the marathon. Right, okay, so moving on from that, does it result in a performance improvement? Well, yes, of course it does. Well, maybe not of course, but yes it does. Okay, and I'm just going to show you quickly two studies that show that. This is a study with runners who are either carb loaded or not carb loaded. This is the one not carb loaded for a 30-kilometer running trial. They ran around about 150 minutes, and then the same runners, when they were carb loaded over here, ran about 130 minutes. And that's supported by a number of other studies. I'm just showing you one such study. And then another one just to kind of make my point. In this study, looking at either people who are carbohydrate loaded or these people called controlled who weren't carbohydrate loaded. If you look over here, this top panel shows running speed, and this is the distance off to the right. So what we have is you start off running and you gradually get slower, or these people did, gradually get slower, and it's shown over here. But if you're not carb loaded, the speed drops off. That would be the 35-10 mark or so in the marathon when the muscle glycogen runs out. And what happens to the blood glucose? I started off speaking about blood glucose as well. Well, this is blood glucose over here. And if you're carb loaded, the blood glucose concentration is better maintained, whereas over here it drops off. So these people over here, these controlled people, if they were drinking glucose, drinking something, as I spoke about when I started this presentation, they would be a little bit better off here. They would be able to maintain their blood glucose a little bit better. The reason for that is if you're carb loaded, you've also carb loaded your muscle, you've also carb loaded your liver a little bit. And so you've got more liver reserves of glycogen, so you can better maintain your blood glucose concentration. But mainly think of it as two different things. You want to maintain your blood glucose concentrations by drinking carbohydrate during your races, and you want to go into your race with high muscle glycogen concentration. And added to that, you want to have a high carb intake in your normal daily training to maintain your normal glycogen concentration. Otherwise, you can have this happening. And I apologize for the slide, which looks a little bit not so good. But this is muscle glycogen concentration on the left here, where I'm pointing now. And this is time or days, whatever you want to, on the right here. This started off as a postulate by David Costell and his co-worker Dave Miller way back in early 80s. And what it shows is, if you start off with a normal muscle glycogen concentration for a trained athlete of around about 120, remember that 120, that's where my pointer is now. 120, you go out and train, and you're going to use up glycogen, right? So that's the glycogen drops. Now, if you eat a high carbohydrate diet, or enough carbohydrate, over the next 24 hours, you bring that glycogen back up. So then you go and train again, and you bring it down, and over the next 24 hours, you bring it back up, and it goes down, and it goes up, and it just carries on like that in a sawtooth pattern indefinitely. But if you're not ingesting enough carbohydrates in your normal training diet, you bring down your glycogen stores, and 24 hours later, you haven't restored enough glycogen, and you go and train again, and you bring it down, and you don't restore enough, and you bring it down. Now, of course, the angle of this line over here will depend on just how much below optimum you're ingesting. So there might be one runner that will come up to there and then go along, and it might take 2 weeks before they drive it down to the point where they can't carry on training properly. But the take-home message is that if you eat enough carbohydrate in your normal daily diet, you can maintain your muscle glycogen, showing where the point is going. But if not, you gradually drive the glycogen down, and when it gets down to around about 20-25 millimole per kilogram weight, you're going to be in big trouble. And big trouble is you're not going to be able to maintain your normal daily training. Right, so that ends the section on carbohydrate. How am I doing time-wise? Looks like fine. Okay, so now I'm going to look at a little bit about protein and how we can use protein maybe to help improve recovery. So by eating enough carbohydrate alone, we're going to help our daily training. Can we improve the picture by using protein? Oh, hang on, some take-home messages. I've already said them, but let's just quickly go over them since there's a slide. Okay, so point 1, carbohydrate ingestion maintains low glucose. I spoke about that. I didn't speak about this too much. Probably should have. I said about ingesting carbohydrate during a race, and I've mentioned the different carbohydrate types that one could use. And typically, if you had a 10% carbohydrate drink, let's just say it was that glucose polymer I spoke about, and you ingested around about 600 mils of it per hour, you're going to be getting 1 gram per minute, 60 grams per hour of carbohydrate, and that goes back to that 1 gram a minute that I spoke to you about. You want to maintain your high muscle glycogen that I've been speaking to you about for the last 10 minutes, and you want a high carbohydrate concentration, a high carb input into your daily diet. And now we're on to the protein. Okay, so does it work? Well, I'm going to get strength training out of the way first. So some runners might indulge in a little bit of strength training, maybe particularly the ultra people, so it becomes relevant. Does protein ingestion help with strength training? I'll go so far as to say it's a no-brainer. Yes, it does. Okay, so that's that. We finished the strength training. Okay. Well, just 1 or 2 things of the strength training. I won't be so blasé about it. You might have heard quite a lot about chocolate milk as a potential protein drink. It's not too bad. It contains 5% carbohydrates, so it's got some carb in it. If you want some carbohydrate in your protein drink for various reasons. It contains casein over here, and it contains whey. Those are the 2 proteins contained in milk, and it gives a total of 3% of your milk drink. And that's about right. That's what we want. We typically would have about 2%, 3% protein in the drink. And also it contains this branched chain amino acid called leucine. And I'm not going to go into the details, but leucine is a key amino acid wherever protein is concerned in strength and recovery and so on. It acts as the trigger to switch on the whole synthesis process to build new muscle. So you've got to have enough leucine in your protein drink. And so milk doesn't do too badly, except that the leucine might be a little bit too low. Nevertheless, if you look at some of the studies, this is a study by Steve Phillips looking at milk over here versus soy protein over there, and this was in a group of male athletes who were indulging in some strength training, and all this stuff over here on the left is the amount of protein synthesis that was occurring in these guys. And you can see without applying any statistics, you can see how much more there was of protein synthesis ingesting the milk compared to ingesting the soy. So soy certainly didn't perform here nearly as well as milk did. What about people starting out, they haven't done strength training for the first time, so maybe a marathon runner wants to start doing some strength training. This was researched in this study by Al Hartman. He took 54 untrained weightlifters, started them on a training program, training 5 days per week for 12 weeks, so it was quite a long time. Divided into 3 groups that you'll see in a moment, and they received the supplement after each training session. The supplement was either fat-free milk, which delivered 18 grams of protein. Your protein drink needs to deliver probably at least 15 grams of protein, so that was quite adequate. And then 26 grams of carbohydrate. You want the carbohydrate in your protein drink because that causes your blood insulin concentration to go up, and that's quite an important component in getting the protein, the amino acid, into the muscle. It's kind of the insulin comes and acts as the person to open the door to let the people out the room. So it opens up the pathway into the muscle for the protein to get in. Without the raised insulin, you've got all this amino acid protein that you've ingested, and it's got nowhere to go. It won't get into the muscle very well. So you want some carbohydrate in your drink to get this insulin up. Okay, and then he used soy protein. Wanted to see again how the milk compared against soy. And then a control group that were using only carbohydrate and no protein. And what they found was this. This is the change in lean body mass. These are the people that were the control, that were ingesting only carbohydrate, and you can see that they increased their lean body mass by about 2.5 kilograms. And that's not surprising. These are people that hadn't trained strength training before. They did a 12-week, 5 days a week sessions of strength training. So you'd expect them to gain some strength. And yeah, we see that they did. In the soy group, they did a little bit better. They gained a bit more. And in the milk group, even more still. So once again, the milk group outperformed the soy protein group. So start off this little section by messing around and saying, okay, well that's it for strength, let's move on. And that is now the point I'm going to leave it for strength. The experiments have been very consistent in showing that ingesting protein helps with strength gain. It's when you get onto the endurance side of things that it becomes a little bit more iffy. So let's look at that. Okay, the endurance side actually more or less started in 2003 with this researcher here, John Ivey from the US, doing an experiment that somehow caught the literature's attention. Poor old Mark Tanopolsky from Canada had shown this probably 8 years earlier. He had written up a paper showing that there's possibly some improvements with protein, but it got no press time for some reason. So anyway, John Ivey got all the credit. And what he did was he fed people these were cyclists, either a placebo, a 7% carbohydrate drink, or 7% carbohydrate drink plus some protein in a lab-based experiment on the bike. And what he had them do was they had to cycle for 3 hours at fairly modest intensity, and then after that they were asked to do a high intensity bout of exercise at 85% of max. And what they were asked to do was, they were on the bike, so you can picture a bike in the front here, so a guy cycles for 3 hours at a modestly hard intensity, and then I'll ask him, okay, I'm going to crank it up now, so it's like 85% of your max. I want you to go as long as you can. Okay, so it's not saying I want you to do 40 kilometers as fast as you can on the bike, or 100 k's as fast as you can. It's saying I want you to go as long as you can. So those of you in the audience who run, you just think about it for a moment. If I ask you to run go as far as you can in 2 hours, so just think about that, versus if I ask you, okay, I want you to go 30 k's as fast as you can. There's a slightly different sort of mental set point there. So just keep that in mind as we go through the study. So what did he find? Okay, first of all, with the placebo, the guys could only manage around about 13 minutes, so it immediately tells you that they weren't very good cyclists anyway. They should go for a lot longer than that if they're good cyclists. Then with the 7% carbohydrate drink, they went for 20 minutes, a lot better. And if they had some protein in their drink, they did better yet, and they went for around about 27 minutes. So you can see that there's an improvement with carbohydrate, go back to the first part of the talk. You should have been able to say, yes, that was going to happen. Indeed it did. The flaw is it's 7% carbohydrate. And 7% carbohydrate, guys, is not enough because it doesn't deliver 1 gram a minute. And we know from countless laboratory experiments that if you feed nothing and you feed a half a gram a minute, you get a performance improvement. If you up that to 0.7 grams a minute, you get an improvement in performance. If you add that, up that to a gram a minute, you get a performance improvement. If you add that, up that to 1.2 or 1.3, you get no further performance improvement. So it goes up and up and up and then plateaus. Okay? And so over here, the problem is that 7% was not optimal. But here you have 7% plus 2% protein. And the possibility in this study is that the 2% protein was just acting as an additional energy source and had nothing to do with the protein per se. Can you imagine a Tour de France cyclist adding 2% protein? If Bradley Wiggins suddenly starts taking 2% protein, do you think he's going to really go so much faster than everybody else? Not a chance. So it's an interesting study, but it's not translatable into practice as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so others recognize that as an interesting point, and then maybe the work needed to be redone in a slightly different way. And one of those that picked that up was Mark Saunders from Canada, and he was asking this question. Does it make a difference if you use a time trial instead of this time to exhaustion? So I said, go for as long as you can versus go a set distance. So time trial being the set distance. Go run 30 k's as fast as you can. Does it make a difference if the carbohydrate ingestion is optimal? Feed the person a gram a minute of carbohydrate and compare it against somebody else a gram a minute plus the protein. And what happens if they're well trained? So I told you that those weren't particularly, you can see from the times, they weren't particularly well trained. What happens if you've got a well-trained cyclist? So that's what he did. And what he did was a 20-kilometer lap course that was repeated 3 times, so it was 60 k's. It included quite a lot of climbing that you'll see in just a minute. And this is the drink that they used. So they drank 200 mils every 5 kilometers of the time trial, and they had either 60 grams of carbohydrate or 60 grams of carbohydrate plus the protein. So they get around that problem of inadequate energy intake, the 7% that I was talking to you about in the previous study. And the protein included 18 grams of calcium, so there was enough protein in there to deliver enough leucine. Leucine, like I said, being the trigger. And here's the course, quite hilly with a big hill at the end. And overall what they found was over the entire last lap, so the entire last 20k lap, there was, it looked like a 1.7% improvement in performance. I say it looked like it because it didn't reach statistical significance. But remember, the competitive athletes here will realize that sometimes 1 minute over a very long distance can be quite a lot. Ask somebody comes second in the Olympic marathon who 30 seconds behind the winner. You won't be able to pick that kind of small difference up in a study like this. It's not sensitive enough. So we've got to be very careful if you're trying to translate laboratory experiments to practice. Where does the performance improvement that is not statistically significant in the laboratory maybe actually does have an effect on the road in real life? Nevertheless, in this experiment, it was a 1.7% improvement, but it wasn't significant. What was significant, though, was what happened in the last hill climb. Namely, they were 2.3% faster when they were ingesting the protein, and the power output was almost 5% greater in that last climb up the hill, strongly suggesting that the protein was adding an advantage. In our lab, we wanted to look at what was happening in a 100-kilometer cycling time trial, once again looking at some protein issues, but we wanted to compare that with the mixed carbohydrate drink that was vogue at the time. Remember when I was talking to you about the carbohydrates and I said about mixing carbohydrates together and does it offer performance improvement? So I wanted to look at maybe the optimal that we could offer in terms of carbohydrate ingestion during exercise, and how does that compare against adding some protein. So we got some really highly trained cyclists, got them into the lab, and we fed them either a plain glucose polymer, MD over here for maltodextrin drink. This is a mixed drink. This is now the glucose polymer plus some fructose. And this is the carbohydrate plus some whey protein, 2% whey protein. And this is the time over here to complete the 100K. So they completed it in around about 150 minutes. So anybody knows cycling, that's almost 40 Ks an hour. That's not bad cycling. That's pretty impressive. What did we get in terms of performance? Absolutely no difference. So whether they're ingesting plain glucose polymer, whether they're ingesting the mixed carbohydrate or the protein, there's absolutely no difference in the performance in time to do the time trial. What about how they perceive the effort? Did it feel any different? And again, absolutely not. This is the RPE over here, the rating of perceived exertion. This is duration over here, off to the right. And these are the three groups, these different colors. And you can see they just lie on top of each other. And as time goes on, it obviously goes up. You know, you feel a lot worse at 40 Ks than you do at 10 Ks. That's exactly what's happening here. It just feels harder and harder, and there's no difference from what they were drinking. Okay, what about the measure of muscle damage? We use this thing as a bad marker of creatine kinase, the marker of muscle damage. I say bad marker because although it might be one of the best biochemical markers that we've got of muscle damage, it's still not very good. It tends to be all over the show. But nevertheless, most people do measure it, and if you don't measure it, you're going to get your paper rejected. So we measure it, and it's monkey see, monkey do. Everybody measures it. Everybody knows it's not worth anything. But one day it will die out, and somebody will say you're really wasting money and time on measuring this. Okay, so here we have here it is over here on the left-hand side, and this is the duration over here off to the right, and this is what happened afterwards, the post-trial time. So we measured these people for a couple of days after the trial. And what is there to see? Not much. Absolutely no difference between, once again, the maltodextrin, the mixed drink, or the protein drink. Not during or over here where I'm circulating now, or after, whatever. That's at odds with some of the other studies where there were high increases in creatine. But if you pause for a moment, these are cyclists. A good cyclist should not have some muscle damage after a 100K time trial or a 40K time trial. It just shouldn't happen. So if you do an experiment and you find increases in CK as measures of muscle damage, the one thing that jumps out of you straight away is that this is not a well-trained cyclist. Okay, so if anything, the usefulness of the measurement of the CK in this experiment was at least it proves that they were good cyclists. But it also shows that the protein didn't help bring it down or anything like that. Okay, then this was, so we had no exciting results from either the mixed carbohydrate drink. Remember, when I'm back again, I'm just going to remind you, the mixed carbohydrate drink, I said there's very few, no studies just about that have shown performance improvement. Now, I wasn't even counting this one, but this is one that you've now seen. No performance improvement. This was a 40-kilometer, another 40-kilometer cycling time trial. And this time, we wanted to look at a new kid on the block in terms of protein, which was something called a protein hydrolysate. In this case, a particular type of protein hydrolysate made from the milk protein casein. You get whey protein hydrolysates as well. What a hydrolysate is, if you look in a tub in a pharmacy or some sports shop and a supplement drink or something, and you'll see what's on the side, most times what you'll see when it comes to the protein is whey protein isolate, or whey protein concentrate, or casein isolate, or casein concentrate. You won't see hydrolysate. However, in a few cases you might. And what that hydrolysate is a protein, complete whey protein or complete casein protein that has been in a laboratory, in a commercial manner, been chopped up, if you like, into small pieces, down to almost its individual amino acids. So instead of having this long, complex chain of amino acids making up the protein, it's been kind of like digested, if you like, almost. So it's much smaller and it can be absorbed more rapidly. And if it can be absorbed more rapidly, that will mean that the blood concentrations of the various individual amino acids in the blood will get up higher quicker, and so you get these higher concentrations hitting the muscle, so to speak. And where that might be important is with that trigger enzyme, trigger amino acid that I keep on coming back to, of leucine. If leucine hits the muscle in a big enough concentration, it will act as the trigger to start muscle synthesis. And if you've got muscle synthesis going on after training, it's a no-brainer, you're going to probably have improved recovery because you're repairing your muscle faster. So we were interested in looking at casein hydrolysate. And particularly wanted to ask, did it improve performance? Did it increase muscle glycogen concentration? Because there had been some research work already that had said that it might improve muscle glycogen concentrations, and we've already now known from my earlier part of the talk that muscle glycogen concentration is important. I'm not going to cover this. Did it improve insulin response? Just a quick reminder, I said that in order for the protein to work, you actually need the high insulin, so did it do that? And can we actually measure increased protein synthesis? So we were going to measure those things. And once again, what did we do? 40-kilometer time trial in this case. And this is the performance time. These weren't as good as the last lot that we dealt with. This is 1 hour, 10 minutes for 40K, so they weren't that good. But you can see the carbohydrate drink, a low concentration of the hydrolysate with carbohydrate, and a higher concentration of the hydrolysate with carbohydrate. Absolutely no difference in terms of the time trial performance. The reason we looked at low and high concentrations was just to find out where you made the break point was, how much did you need to take before you get a result. So no difference in performance there. We looked at glycogen. Did it affect how muscle glycogen was restored after exercise? So we gave this into the recovery period as well. And what this shows, carbohydrates, low concentration, high concentration. Although it looks visually like it might be a little bit different, there's a lot of variation over here. And essentially, there's no important difference there in the amount of muscle glycogen that's being restored. So it didn't help with the glycogen, and that has been well accepted now in the literature. So if you are ingesting enough carbohydrate after your training, adding protein isn't going to do anything further of benefit in terms of the glycogen. The only time adding protein to your post-training recovery drink is if you aren't ingesting enough carbohydrate, then maybe you'll help some of the muscle glycogen resynthesis. And does it help with the switching on of the pathway leading to improved protein synthesis? Yes, it does. This complicated looking thing on the left-hand side here, that's a measure of what is called phosphorylated mTOR. mTOR is something, for those of you who like a long word, from the mammalian target of rapamycin. It's a key protein that's activated in the muscle that leads down the pathway of muscle synthesis. So if you measure this mTOR and you find it's being switched on, if you like, in the muscle after protein feeding, that means that that muscle is now churning away more rapidly than normal, manufacturing new protein. And if you look at carbohydrate compared to the low concentration of the protein, there's an improvement. It might look a little, but in this case that's a lot, and a little bit more in the higher concentration. So certainly what this casein hydrolysate did was switch on muscle protein synthesis. And subsequent experiments like this have gone on to show repeatedly that you can switch on the protein synthesis pathway by ingesting protein post-exercise. Okay, so what does all that mean to recovery? With that background, a number of people have looked specifically at the recovery process. And this is an intriguing study done by John Buckley a couple of years ago now. He looked at muscle force shown here as percentage. So if you go 60, 70, 80, 90, up to 100%. So if I took any two of you from the audience sitting here and I measured the muscle force of one person, maybe they're going to have a value of 100 in whatever way I'm measuring your muscle force. And I take Tammy over there, and she's been doing some strength training in the gym, so she gets 120. So she's stronger. So how do I compare her against the other person? Well, one way of doing it would be on a percentage basis. So he did this experiment based on every individual's own percentage improvement or decline based on their previous value. So over here at the start of the experiment, it's going to be 100%. So he measured people's strength in their legs, and that was the initial start value was that was the 100% value. We then made them do some drop jumps. So it's like jumping off this table onto the floor repeatedly, and that induces some muscle damage, and they'll be sore the next day. So he did that, and he measured their strength in the same way after 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, 6 hours, and 24 hours. And of course, you'd expect it to be a decline in strength, even though they wouldn't be sore yet after 1 hour, 2 hours, etc., etc. And he fed them either a placebo drink, a whey protein drink, a casein, or a protein hydrolysate that I've just been talking to you about, the protein hydrolysate. Okay, so using the placebo, immediately afterwards, 30 minutes afterwards, the strength had gone down and it stayed fairly low for the next 24 hours. Similar with the casein, similar again with whey. So their strength had declined as you probably would expect. But lo and behold, with protein hydrolysate, their strength comes back very, very rapidly. Quickly as 6 hours, they're back to the 100% value. Now, I don't know if this experiment, gosh, it's really annoying. Is that your watch time?
Oh, sorry. Don't do that.
Kill it. So within 6 hours, it comes back to the 100% value. When I first saw that, I really suspected that there was something had gone wrong in the methodology or something like that. It couldn't be real, but it's been published and it's been through peer review. And so at this point, we've got to accept it as being real. There might be something behind the scenes that was peculiar to this experimental setup and might not be repeatable. I don't know if anybody has tried to repeat it, but it's certainly food for thought. Nick Luden, working out of Canada, did a similar experiment in terms of looking at recovery, and he looked at some distance runners in the baseline state or after 6 days of ingesting a protein hydrolysate. And this is that marker again that I mentioned to you, the creatine kinase, the same as before. And here is two groups. A group that had only carbohydrate as their recovery drink post-training, and this group over here, who had a mixture of carbohydrate and the protein hydrolysate. This I've labeled for casein hydrolysate. And you can see that the two were pretty much the same in terms of their CK values at the start of the experiment. They're sitting at just over 200, which is kind of where you'd expect it for somebody who's engaged in quite a hard training program. But look what happens after 6 days when they have been taking either the carbohydrate or the casein hydrolysate during a period where the training load, the running load, was increased substantially. If you look at the carbohydrate, they go up from there to there. And if you look at the casein hydrolysate intake, they stay the same. So it's certainly good evidence that the casein hydrolysate has helped improve recovery in these runners. What happened to their soreness? It's a difficult one to interpret. This is a scale over here on the left of the amount of soreness perceived in the muscle. Why it's difficult is because this group at the start had a slightly higher soreness that they were reporting than the carbohydrate group. But nevertheless, if you kind of ignore that and just look from left to right, what you get is the carbohydrate group, they kind of stayed the same, but the group taking the hydrolysate, they actually decreased the amount of soreness that they were reporting. So it's a difficult slide to interpret what exactly it means because of this difference over here. I kind of think of it as sort of superficial evidence that something was going on. Then, more recently, I did a study with looking at muscle soreness in rugby players. These were the South African Sevens side. They were in the training camp. They took either a placebo or some of the protein hydrolysate, and they also filled in a questionnaire. We didn't do any muscle biopsies. They wouldn't let us do that. Wouldn't even let us take blood. And so it was all perception-based stuff, unfortunately. And we looked at hamstrings, quads, calf muscles. And we looked at a number of different daily activities, rest, just normal activity, and the muscle was under stretch or there's pressure applied to the muscle. And what is found was that if we look at the pain that has been reported, this is Now, the first 4 days of the experiment, then this weekend over here where I'm moving my cursor on. This is the next weekend over here again. The next week of training, weekend, and then the finish of the study. And this is the pain score over here. And what happens is, if you look at the protein hydrolysate group, the reddish group, they just stay down low. They don't move. So similar to that Luden study with runners that I showed you. Over here in this group, it increased over here. And that was after a particularly hard training bout that was aimed at the quadriceps muscle. Both groups back down here again after the weekend, which is kind of expected. And exactly the same thing in the calf muscle. It stays down low with the protein hydrolysate, but goes up higher over here in the group that was not getting protein hydrolysate. And when you look at fatigue, that is pain. When you look at fatigue, absolutely no difference between the groups. So I actually think there's a difference between pain and fatigue, and maybe that's something that's being missed in a lot of the experiments. So if you're trying to you take your protein hydrolysate purely to reduce fatigue, maybe it's not going to do anything. But if you're trying to take it to improve muscle damage, which is a good thing to do, then the protein hydrolysate is probably a good thing to take. I'm going to end it there. I have a summary slide that just recaps all of that, but I'm pretty much out of time, so I think the message is there. So we can cover any other questions after that in the question and answer session. Okay, thank you everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Bosch. That was pretty amazing. We have one more speaker, and then she's going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open up the some question and answers, and then we're going to break for lunch and walk over to where lunch is going to be served. Dr. Tamara Hugh Butler, she's the assistant professor at the University of Oakland in Rochester, Michigan. She has completed her PhD in exercise sciences, fluid balance endocrinology from the University of Cape Town, and she also has a doctorate of podiatry medicine from Temple University. Her major areas of research have been renal failure and biomechanics, exercise endocrinology again. She's a member of the American College of Sports Medicine and American College of Foot and Ankle Surgeons, and she was also the former assistant director for the Houston Marathon. Dr. Tamara Hugh.
Can you switch on the microphone? No. Nadim, maybe switch on the microphone even if
Thank you for hanging in there. We're going to talk about water and salt balance today, because water and salt imbalances kill runners. So that's why I want to start with the most bad things that people can happen to runners if their water and salt balance is off. So today we're going to start talking about hyponatremia, one of the bad things that can happen. Hyponatremia means low salt. How many of you actually have heard of hyponatremia? Okay, good. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to go over the second bad thing can happen if you have water and salt imbalances, which is rhabdomyolysis and renal failure. And if you know of anybody who's had kidney failure in any of your runners. Okay, good. Not very many. Then after the bad things that are going to happen, we're going to talk about recommendations for fluid intake during a race, as well as recommendations, what the literature says, on sodium intake during a race. Then I'm going to conclude with recommendations. So what is hyponatremia? We call it exercise-associated hyponatremia, or EAH. Hyponatremia is the occurrence of hyponatremia in individuals engaged in prolonged physical activity and is defined by a serum or plasma taken from your blood. Sodium concentration below the normal reference range of the laboratory performing the test. So if I take a blood sample of any of you right now, your body sodium should be at a concentration between 135 and 145. If you think about it, that is a very, very limited range. If I took a blood test of every dog, cat, mouse, worm, it's also going to be regulated tightly between 135 and 145. And I'll show you why that is important. If your blood sodium concentration is below 135, we call that hyponatremia, low blood salt. If your sodium concentration is above 145, we call that hypernatremia, high blood salt. And why do we care about that? Because normal natremia, this again is 135 to 145, where your blood sodium normally is. Where your blood sodium normally is, all of your cells are at the right size, where they want to be, where they function naturally. Because water flows in and out between cells, sodium actually stays on the outside. It can't go in between. Potassium stays on the inside. So if you have high blood sodium, what happens is the water goes from inside of the cell to outside the cells, and the cells actually shrink. When you have hyponatremia, low blood salt concentration, water actually flows from outside of the cells inside of the cells so that the cells swell. So if I think about tomatoes, if your blood sodium gets too high, all of your cells shrivel. If you actually get hyponatremia, all the water rushes inside of the cells, what can happen is the cells can burst. Where is that a problem in your body? This is a problem in two distinct places. So normal natremia, this is a normal sodium. This is an X-ray taken of the lungs in a normal sodium. This is your brain with all the little sulcus and the ventricles when you have a normal sodium. If you have hyponatremia, the cells swell. Your lungs fill up with fluid and you get pulmonary edema. Your brain swells. And what happens with your brain is when your cells swell in your brain, it can only swell about 1% to 2% before it gets stuck against the skull. So what happens if your brain swells too much? People die from hyponatremia because their brain swells so much that it pushes the brainstem out, and that's how you die. You die from pulmonary edema, and you die from brain swelling. That's why hyponatremia in athletes is bad. So what is the incidence of hyponatremia in athletes? We see it mostly in endurance athletes. We saw it first in the standard marathon, 42.2K. So when we actually take blood samples from normal people who finish when we start to do these races and do studies, we see about 13% of a normal field running a marathon coming in with hyponatremia. But most of them don't know it. We call it asymptomatic. About 1% become symptomatic. Those are the people with brain swelling. These are the people with pulmonary edema. They can go into coma. So we've had at least 5 deaths in a marathon. What about ultra marathons? So now I've started to do some races, particularly the Western States Endurance Run, which is 100 miles. We see on a hot day 30 to 50%, or 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of 2 runners on a hot day running a 100-miler, we see finishing a race with hyponatremia. So that's a big deal here with the ultimate running community. However, probably less than 1% actually have brain swelling and lung swelling. But again, we're worried about this because we actually don't know how many people go from not having symptoms to having lots of symptoms. We also see it in Ironman triathlons where running is lax. We see that about 18% in some of the New Zealand triathlons, Hawaii Ironman, and we saw clinically symptomatic people with brain swelling at about 12%. So how do you get low blood sodium? You can do it really by 2 ways. So you can get a low blood sodium. So this is, if the normal sodium is the rocks and the whiskey is the water. If you drink too much water, you pour too much water, you dilute the rocks. So over drinking can lead to hyponatremia. Also, because we sweat when we run, our sweat contains salt. So people who sweat a lot, when it's really, really hot, if you lose too much salt through your sweat or through your urine, people who are diuretics in the medical, we see this well, you can also get hyponatremia. So if you drink too much water or you lose too much salt in your sweat, you can get this disorder. However, most of us can regulate the salt and water balance fairly well within our body. and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. So again, we think about, okay, you can drink too much water or you can lose too much salt. But if you think about it, hyponatremia, there's a combination, because when you do run, you will lose some salt. When you do run, you will get thirsty, you will drink. So in most cases, it's kind of a mixed disorder. Well, you actually will have both, and we have to be careful about that. So in most cases of athletic hyponatremia, it is a mixed water retention and salt loss. We also think that there has to be some variation of antidiuretic hormone secretion. Again, if you think about it, our bodies are adapted. Once we actually start running, our body actually wants to conserve water. It wants to conserve salt. So I'm studying vasopressin quite a bit, but we won't go into that today. So again, when we started looking at athletes who developed low sodium hyponatremia, we first looked at over 2,000 athletes, but these are at Ironman triathlon and below. So marathon and Ironman. So these things lasted maybe about 18 hours or less. So what we saw in this graph was people who gained weight. And you should never gain weight in a marathon. So in the clinical setting, if you gain weight, generally what that means is you're drinking too much water and you're not letting it out. So when we looked at people who were running for less than 18 hours, what we found is people who gained weight, they seem to have the lowest sodium, which told us that probably most of the cases of hyponatremia were from people who drank way too much water during the race. Although there is a lot of variation. Again, too, because hyponatremia is below 135, there's still a lot of variation between people who gained weight and people who lost weight. So at Western States, we routinely test everybody who comes to the finish line of their blood sodium. We actually found the opposite. People who ran 100 miles at the Western States Endurance Run, the people who were hyponatremic, they actually lost weight. So what that told us is people who are running for more than 24 hours, like most of you will be this weekend, they will probably have more of a variant of salt loss through sweat. So again, too, what I want to caution people is a lot of people say, well, how much should I drink? And people say, well, you should replace body weight. But what happens, like Dr. Bosch was talking about, when you load with glycogen, glycogen actually binds water. So when athletes actually start a race, if they've carbo-loaded, they will actually start off higher than their normal weight because they've actually the glycogen has hold on to water. But so when you start running and you start burning the glycogen, you will actually release this water within your body. So you will actually have a water store as you continue to run. So we have to be very, very cautious about using a scale to monitor how much fluid that you take in and you take off. So this is actually a slide from one of my colleagues in Singapore. And he actually took body weights of people from 5K, 10K, marathon. But what you see is the longer the distance, so we look at the clear triangles and squares, the longer the distance, the more variation we see in body weight. Meaning, people have to eat. So the weight, the longer the distance, the less that you want to rely on body weight as a regulator of how much fluid that you need during a race. So body weight changes during exercise become less reliable indicators of fluid balance as race distance progresses. So again, for those of you who are caring for athletes, for those of you who are in the medical, what are some of the signs and symptoms that we see when we worry about low sodium in our athletes? Well, this is the problem because this hyponatremia looks like a lot of other entities that we'll see. So if people start drinking too much, well, they should have a history of over-drinking. They'll feel bloated. God, I feel bloated. The rings don't fit. They'll start vomiting clear fluids because that's the only mechanism that you have to get rid of if you drink too much is to vomit. Their blood pressure might be normal or a little bit high. They may have an increase in body weight, and then they may urinate, they may not. If you have antidiuretic hormone, that's the problem. It actually keeps the water in. If you're if you're sweating too much and you're losing too much salt, they actually will be thirsty. They'll have a dry mouth. If you pinch their skin, it'll actually stay up. That's called tenting. They will have a lower body weight. They won't urinate. And if you stand them up and lay them down, they start to fall. So the problem is, this looks like a lot of different entities. This looks like low blood sugar. This looks like high blood salt. So it is very, very hard to diagnose hyponatremia by just symptoms. We actually have, we use a portable analyzer where we can take a skin prick of blood and actually put it into a machine, and within 3 minutes we actually can look at blood sodium. Again, for those of you who will work in a tent, we look at what are some of the biochemical markers that we can see. And again, why is this important? Because if you're treating an athlete, if they are of the low salt variety, we can put in an IV of normal saline. If they are of the over drinking variety, you don't want to do that because you'll load them with fluid. So if you are a medical personnel, what are the things that we see? Well, obviously they will have a high urosmolality. ADP will be high, they have low sodium. But with the variant of overhydration, they will have an increase in weight. Their BUN would be low, which would be the baseline. They would have a high urine sodium, which we can measure. And again, too, with the mixed variety, we want to look at the urine sodium. If it's lower than 30, you probably want to give them normal saline. If it's higher than 30, you want to give them hypertonic saline. So, hyponatremia is a life-threatening fluid and sodium imbalance. We see more in ultra-endurance athletes than we do in shorter distances. It can be diagnosed only by a blood test. And I don't know if they'll have that actually here. Hopefully they will. Hyponatremia is caused by a combination of excess fluid consumption as well as sweat sodium losses during ultra-endurance running. So you will have both at this race. So let's go into, that's the first bad thing that happens to athletes and we want to look out for. This is the second bad thing that happens. Rhabdomyolysis and renal failure. Dr. Bosch talked a little bit about CK, which measures muscle damage, and we'll go into that. Obviously, our body is 40% muscle. So skeletal muscle actually contains 50% of our water and 70% of our potassium, which is quite a lot. When we run, we're using all of our skeletal muscle, which is compared to our extracellular fluid. So we worry about breaking down muscle. So what is rhabdomyolysis? Rhabdomyolysis is literally the dissolution of skeletal muscles. When you run, you can either dissolve skeletal muscle by direct or indirect injury. Obviously, when you run, with all that repetitive trauma, will break the muscle. But also, if you get depletion of ATP, hypoglycemia, or you get an increase in intracellular calcium, all of these things will also break muscles. So, rhabdomyolysis is characterized by leakage of the muscle cell contents into the circulation. The most dangerous of these contents when the muscle breaks is myoglobin. So when we see renal failure, your kidneys starting to fail, acute kidney injury is a dire complication of severe rhabdomyolysis from an increase in myoglobin. So again, when you're running, you get depletion of ATP, the muscle cells break. It's the stuff within the muscle cells that goes into the blood that becomes dangerous to the kidneys. So again, if we take a muscle biopsy that Dr. Bosch had said, before a race they all look so beautiful. These are fat droplets. This is just after a standard marathon, 42.2K. That's what the muscles look like afterwards. It would be amazing. There'll be quite a bit more, probably after the 24-hour. So how do we measure rhabdomyolysis? Again, we measure CPK because it's easy. CPK being an enzyme that converts creatinine to phosphocreatine. Normal range is between 60 to 400 international units. CPK is found mostly in skeletal muscle, but it's also found in the heart and the brain. So after heart attacks, people measure this as well. So it gives us an indirect marker of muscle damage. And it is a surrogate measure to measure muscle damage. But it is the myoglobin that actually induces is a toxin to the kidneys. So this data that we took from finishers at the Western States Endurance Run in 2011. There was a weak relationship between CK and blood sodium, but what I wanted to direct your attention to is the mean. If I told you the normal range is between 60 to 400 to 600 international units, most runners finish the Western States 100-miler with a CPK around 35,000. It's a lot more. So, but most of the runners, they don't go on to renal failure. But it just goes to suggest you that a lot of people who run these races will have a lot of muscle damage. That's part of the course. What's very interesting is, though, most runners who have these huge levels of CPK and muscle damage never go on to renal failure. It's really interesting. So they actually did a study. They looked at all the people who came into the emergency room, about a 250,000 people who came to an emergency room. Most people with these really, really high levels went into renal failures, but none of the athletes did. There's something about running that does protect the kidneys against these really high levels of CPK. Particularly women don't seem to have a high degree. They seem to be particularly saved against renal failure. We're not sure exactly why. Then get to when we look at military recruits, again, we see high CPKs, a lot of muscle damage, but we don't see a lot of kidney failure, which is a good thing, but we do start to see it. What are the two things? If you have a high CPK and a lot of muscle damage, you have to have two other things before your kidneys will fail. One is you have to have hypovolemia. So in the old days, when you used to run, and it used to be a strong thing if you don't drink any water. So if they didn't drink any water and they finished dehydrated, they would have low blood volume. So if you have high CPK and low blood volume, this allows the myoglobin to concentrate and get stuck in the kidneys. So this has to happen too. That's why they started to tell you need to drink. You also have to have an acid urine. And people who sprint, do really, really high intensity workout, they will have acidosis, but we don't see that in these 24-hour races as much. So what the acid urine does is it makes the myoglobin actually split apart, and one part of that actually is toxic to the kidneys. So again, it's not only the high muscle damage, you actually have to have both hypovolemia and aciduria before your kidneys will fail. So now what we're worried about, we're seeing something completely different in ultra runners. In ultra runners, we're seeing a combination of hyponatremia and rhabdomyolysis, which is actually curious. I'll tell you why that's a really big problem. We don't actually know which comes first. We don't know if hyponatremia comes first. The cells get really big. Since they get so big, they're fragile. Like when you think about water balloons, the more that you fill a balloon, the more fragile it becomes, right? So we don't know if the hyponatremia makes the muscles more fragile and they break, or actually if you get muscle breakdown, that actually clogs the kidneys so that you can't lose the water. So we're starting to see this, and we're worried about people like this who run for over 20 hours. So again, going back to our data from the Western States 211, we had at this time we had 6% of our finishers, which was pretty low. We had only had 12 people finish the race with hyponatremia, but it was very mild. It was a sodium of 133, and again, normal is 135, so they weren't like severely hyponatremic. But what we found was the runners who had hyponatremia, their average CPK was 54,000. Normal is 600, so this is pretty big. People who finished with normal sodium values, which were 195 people, their average CPK was 30,000. So again, what this tells us is maybe if you get hyponatremia, your cells swell, they become fragile, they break easier. This is the race that was in Australia, the Great North. Isn't the Great North Run? Anyway, so the red is we followed a bunch of runners, and we took blood at the start, at halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, and after the race. So the red line is everybody, all the runners in the race. The blue line is a runner who developed hyponatremia hyponatremia at checkpoint 2, and this is their CPK. So again, this tells us once he got hyponatremia, his CPK level went way up. Again, to cell swelling, they break a lot easier. This is at the 100-mile race, at the same race. Again, another runner was hyponatremia at checkpoint 2 and at 4. And again, the blue line compared to everybody else, which is red, after he had hyponatremia, his CPK went up really, really high. So again, why do we care about the combination of hyponatremia and muscle cell breakdown? Is because if we see this in the tent. The treatment, if you have hyponatremia, too much water, everything's swelling, our treatment here is to restrict water. We don't want to give you any water because we don't want any more swelling. If you come in with rhabdomyolysis, the treatment is to increase water because we want to flush the kidneys out. So when I see a runner coming in with hyponatremia and rhabdomyolysis, I have to think, do I keep away the fluid to save the brain, or do I give fluid and save the kidney? So when we see this combination, do we save the brain or the kidney? It's a big deal because the treatments are conflicting, and we mostly see this in ultra runners. So what we're doing now is we're giving a little bolus of a really concentrated salt that will hopefully get all the water out of the brain and the chest. And then after that, we try to give a little bit more isotonic saline so that we can try to get the kidneys going too. So that's a problem that we're starting to see that we need to explore further in these really long events. So in summary, rhabdomyolysis is common after ultra-endurance races. We have to look for this. Acute renal failure, however, is rare, but we're starting to see more of it. Hyponatremia, rhabdomyolysis, and renal failure is a unique problem to ultra-endurance runners. So if you start to have cases, please at least contact me because we're starting to put together a case series and try to learn more about this. So now that we know the bad stuff that can happen, what are some of the recommendations to take fluid? Well, why do we need fluid in the first place? We need fluid because runners sweat. Every time that you run, your muscles generate heat that needs to be lost. And the way that humans do that is we sweat. We lose fluid and we lose sodium. Exercise beyond 40% of our VO2 max, which is a really slow jog, we lose 90% water and almost 90% sodium, all just through sweating, so we'll need to replace that. The average sweat sodium concentration will vary, but it's always below the concentration of your blood. So again, we knew that blood sodium concentration is between 135 and 145. Your sweat sodium concentration is probably about 35, which is pretty low. But most of us will lose sweat, and the better trained we are, we'll actually lose less sodium. So what about water? How do we regulate water? Well, we have what we call an unregulated and regulated water metabolism. Unregulated is what we call need-free. It's when we get up in the morning and we have to drink our coffee not because we need it, because we like it, or if we're going out with beer, we drink because of social, or we drink habitual. We're just used to drinking, we're going out with friends. So we call this unregulated. So if people tell you to drink a certain amount, that's unregulated. But our body has redundant systems that actually regulate the amount of water that we hold in or we get out based on the salt concentration. So we have regulated water metabolism, those drinking according to thirst and excreting according to the levels of antidiuretic hormone. So whatever we do, normally we can accommodate that, unless you're a kangaroo rat who gets all of its water from just eating carbohydrates. So what is thirst? Thirst is one of the more powerful of behavioral drives. The craving for water cannot be ignored and can become sufficiently intense to dominate all other thoughts and sensations. So again, if you go on a run and it's hot and you forgot your water bottle, the only thing that you can think about is when you're running and you haven't had any fluid is when you're going to get that water, right? We can know, we have a sensation built in when we need water. So in healthy adults, thirst is actually regulated largely, if not exclusively, by what we call the effective osmotic pressure of plasma. It's driven by the amount of salt that we have. If the salt gets high, we drink more water. If it's low, we actually don't drink and we pee it out. Thirst is regulated in a very ancestral old part of our brain. It's the same part of our brain that actually regulates when we get hungry. It's the same part of our brain that says, gee, my bladder's full, I've got to go to the bathroom. So the physiological sensation of being thirsty is designed to protect both the salt concentration in your body as well as the volume. And again, too, if you don't have enough water circulating through your blood volume, you will actually get thirsty as well, so that your body will regulate that. This actually occurs within the normal physiological range. Now I'll show you what that means. So if you drink when you're thirsty, that will prevent against hypernatremia and hyponatremia. If you drink on a schedule, you may overdo it and not know it. So again, too, when people say, what is probably the best way to drink? Drink when you feel like you're thirsty, and it's not too late. Your body is not in danger if you wait until you're thirsty. Prescribed drinking on a schedule, drinking according to your body weight, is good only when you are running in a very steady state, controlled fashion. So if the temperature is going to be exactly the same, you're going to be running exactly the same pace, and the weather's going to be the same, then you can probably go into prescribed drinking. But a lot of races, you get hot, it gets cold, you go faster, you get slower, so then that's when prescribed drinking goes out the window. So again, if this is the normal range, they always say that, oh, if you get thirsty, it's too late. Generally what happens is if your antidiuretic hormone will kick in right at a normal range of sodium. Once you get close to the normal range of sodium and exceed that, you will start to get thirsty. Thirst is not stimulated way beyond when you're in a danger zone. It's actually stimulated within a normal range of sodium. So it is a physiologically relevant sensation. So again, too, if you drink according to body weight, all this tells you that is in this blue. This is looking at all the field studies that were taken in people who are actually running races. Like, again, we talked about if you carbo load, that holds into water. So if you lose anywhere between 2 to 4% of your body weight when you're running, that's normal. That's normal. That's when your sodium's going to stay in the same range. If you maintain weight or you increase weight, that's when you're retaining water and your sodium's going to go down. If you probably lose more than 5% of your body weight, we see that when people who are vomiting or people who get very, very nauseous, then they start to have some problems on the high end. Their sodium concentration gets a little too high from there. So again, if you lose to about 2 to 4% of your body weight, that'll keep that's when thirst is stimulated, and that's when your blood sodium concentration will be in the normal range. So, in summary, water intake is highly regulated by your body. It's governed cooperatively by thirst stimulation, as well as antidiuretic hormone secretion, so that your antidiuretic hormone will let you hold on to all the water that you take, and then if you need more, you will get thirsty. What about salt? The studies have shown that sodium supplementation will be beneficial if you are performing high-intensity work in hot ambient temperatures. If you are not acclimatized to the heat, if you train at this temperature and it's going to be 50 degrees Celsius tomorrow, you need salt. If you are exercising for 24 hours, you probably need a little bit of salt. But your body will tell you, gee, I think I need, you will actually crave, and we'll talk about that. So what this tells you, again, this is the 5 races that we did at Western States. And On the y-axis is the incidence of hypernatremia, and this on the x-axis is the temperature. That's the maximum temperature of the race, and this is the average between the minimum and the maximum temperature. And what we see is the hotter the temperature, the higher the degree of hypernatremia. And again, what this suggests is, so if the temperature outside is going to be probably 15 to 16 degrees Celsius, like it is going to be perhaps this weekend, we see maybe 1 out of 10 getting hypernatremia. If it's hot, if it's above 25, 30 degrees Celsius, we see about 1 out of every 2 coming in with hypernatremia. So the weather does play a big role. So we know that if your water is low, you get thirsty. But what we haven't figured out in humans is if your salt is low, do you actually have a sodium appetite? Animals do, but in humans we don't think that we do. But we have something different. We have what we call palatability, meaning if you're running for a long time and you start to lose sodium, what happens is when you go to that aid station, you see those potato chips, or you see potatoes with salt, and you say, oh my God, that looks so good. You actually crave salt if we start to lose it. We call that palatability. So normally, the sodium recommendations for most people is about 1.5 grams or 60 millimoles per day of sodium. That's what your body requires. And that's what's recommended by the IAU, a little bit more than males than females because they're bigger. So for those of us ingesting a westernized diet, sodium supplementation is unnecessary because most of us get 2 to 3 times that amount that is required. So how do we can actually do a food record to see how much sodium that people eat. Or if I collect all of your urine for a whole day, generally the salt that you take in is the salt that comes out. You regulate yourself in steady state. So when I took the urines of people who were running Western states, what I saw was their total sodium for 24 hours is 195 sodiums per water. And again, what did I tell you what the normal, what you need? You only need 60. So people who are running Western states were taking in 3 times as much sodium in their normal diet than they needed. Now actually what we did is we collected their urine during the race. When they needed to urinate, we gave them little baggies. They just peed in a bag and they threw it on the trail. And my research assistants actually picked it up. Undergrads do that. So what we found is the sodium in their urine during the race was 8. Even if I was off a little bit, your body just conserved as much sodium as it possibly could so that you really lost no sodium during your urine. And even 24 hours afterwards, your body was still conserving sodium. So your body tries to conserve it while you're running, which is a good thing. So that leads us to a question is then, we know that urine sodium is regulated, but we're not exactly sure if sodium when you lose through sweat is regulated as well. So we're starting to look at those studies. And this is actually a biopsy of a sweat gland. And what we're looking at are these regulatory channels called octoportin 5s that lead us to believe that sweat sodium, if you're running and you need salt, you will actually conserve it from your sweat as well as the urine. And that just supports that as well. So again, we don't think that humans have a true sodium appetite because if you look at Addisonian patients who lose salt, they have no aldosterone, they don't really have a salt appetite. But again, when we look at palatability, how good does that salt want? We see that athletes who lose salt, they will actually crave saltier foods. We see this in exercise, we see this in hemodialysis patients, we see this when we actually deplete subjects experimentally. They will actually crave salt. So again, too, this is a really elegant experiment from a lab. On the x-axis, this is just sodium concentration in people's blood. So the higher the sodium concentration, and this is palatability. So if it's a negative value, it says that, oh, I don't want that salt. So what this graph shows us is in these athletes is if your blood sodium gets really high, the last thing you want is salt. But the lower that your blood sodium concentration goes, the more that you actually will crave saltier foods. And it is a linear relationship. So actually I did this last year in the laboratory. And what this showed was I had people exercise. And I thought that's what was regulated by a certain receptor called a V2. But what this study showed with this line is people who actually had saltier sweat were the people who craved saltier foods. So even if you just look at the black dot, which is the placebo pill, just like the black dot, if your sodium in your sweat was salty, you craved saltier foods. And that was what we say about this relationship is the sodium in your salt predicted 55% of how salty you like your food. So if your sodium in your sweat was not very salty, you didn't like salty food. But you know people who really always want salt, they actually have saltier sweat. So there is some regulation there by design. So again, too, we think, okay, if we're losing all the salt, is there any other place that maybe in our body that we can get salt? And there's evidence now to say that 40% of your bones are made of salt. We think that calcium, we know that our bones contain calcium, but 40% of the salt is actually locked in your bone. So we actually had a DEXA scan before and after the Western States run. We started out with 18 people, we only finished with 6. But these 6 people, so we looked at the change in their blood sodium concentration, and then we looked at their total bone mineral density. And that's a pretty straight line. And what we think that this tells us is that if your blood sodium concentration got low, you actually pulled sodium from your bone. And if your sodium was high, that actually was put inside of your bone. And again, too, this is looking at your lumbar spine, where we actually look at osteoporosis in people, because it's very, very spongy. And we actually measured how much sodium that they took in during the race. And what we found is, if they took in a lot of sodium, their spine density went up after the race. If they didn't take in that much sodium, their bone in their spine remained the same. So we think that in your bones and in your skin, there is a source of sodium. If you lose it, that we can buffer that during exercise. And again, too, we think on the x-axis, we think that most of these regulatory actions are by a hormone called aldosterone. However, so you think, oh, well, you know, there's still mixed results in terms of how much sodium do we need to take in during the race? What does the data tell us? Well, so the 2 races that we did do at 100-mile races showed us, obviously there's people who finished the race and people who didn't. And in both races, people who finished the race took in more sodium than those who didn't. We're not exactly sure why. Maybe it's to protect blood sodium. Maybe it's, there's actually evidence to show that salt influences mood. So people who eat a lot of salt, they seem to be happier. So people who took in the most salt, they are the ones that finished. We did this twice, and it was the same result. So people say, okay, well, let's take in a lot of salt during these races. Is there a bad side to taking in a whole bunch of salt? So there's a cyclist who's doing a race across America. And again, I told you, the recommended salt is 1.5 grams, or 60 millimoles. So this cyclist was taking in 25 grams a day, or 1,000 millimoles. That's a lot of salt. So he was taking that in and thinking, oh, it's going to benefit me. So what happened to him is when he started to go into the mountains, he retained so much fluid that he went into pulmonary edema and was hospitalized. So again, what happens in humans, if you take in way too much salt, even 100 to 150 millimoles, that's accompanied by water weight. Again, you put in more salt, you get thirsty, you drink, you don't let that go, and you get water weight. So if you take in a lot of salt, you will actually gain water. And again, if you're running, so what we're finding is in Western states is we're getting people coming in 10 pounds, 5 kilograms over their baseline weight. And we take their sodium. And we think, oh, you're drinking too much. They took in a lot of salt, it made them thirsty, and they actually they were not hyponatremic, but they retained water because they take in salt. So we're starting to see if people are taking a lot of salt during races, hypervolemic normonatremia. They're just bloated with water. It takes them about 5 days before they get rid of that. So if you do take in way too much salt during exercise, you will get weight gain, your temperature will go up, and actually your heart rate will go up as well. So we don't know if that's good or bad, but if you were taking a lot of salt, that might happen to you. So, but if you, again, so we did studies to say if you took in too much salt, would it protect you against hyponatremia? So this was an Ironman study, and if you just look at the white dot was people who took in salt, the yellow dot was people who took in corn syrup, but they looked the same, they didn't know, and then people who didn't take any salt. And again, too, if you lost weight and you drank only when you're thirsty, the salt had nothing to do with your blood sodium concentration. However, if you're going to drink too much, if you're going to drink 100% of your body weight losses, it will cause the sodium will be helpful to you, but it won't prevent hyponatremia. So this is what they had runners taking high, low, or no sodium beverages, but if you can see, their body weight went up, so they're replacing far more fluid than they needed. They all went into hyponatremia, but if you took salt, their sodium was a little bit higher than those who didn't take in any salt. So again, does it prevent hyponatremia? It may limit it, but it won't prevent it if you take in too much fluid. So summary of this data, sweat sodium losses appear to be regulated. So again, it's not like in, out. There seems to be some regulation with your bone, with your, in your urine and in your sweat that occurs when you're running to conserve it. Electrolyte beverage which contains salt, may delay the onset of hyponatremia, but it doesn't prevent it. You will need salt if it's going to be really, really hot and if you're running for a long time. So again, taking no salt, well, it'll probably benefit you, the runners who are going to be running for 24 hours. What are my final recommendations? I hope that if anything you got, that there is some regulation by your body in terms of the water and the salt, so that you don't have to always try to calculate it all the time. Your body actually does that. And when you try to outsmart it, that's when the people get in trouble. So fluid and sodium balance are highly regulated through redundant, evolutionary conserved physiological mechanisms that are aimed to protect sodium during and after exercise. So if you drink when you're thirsty, and if you crave salty, if those chips look good to you, if those potatoes and that salt, go for it. Your body's trying to tell you something. When you try to outsmart it, that's when you get in trouble. So use body weight as a guide, but never use it as a rule in long races. Drink when you're thirsty, eat salt when you want it, particularly in hot weather and unacclimated people. Again, salt may attenuate the development of hyponatremia, but it doesn't prevent it. Of all things, of all of these really highly trained athletes, above all else, listen to your body. It will try to tell you something. So, hyponatremia, rhabdomyolysis, and acute renal failure are more common in ultra-endurance runners. However, the life-threatening concentration, the death and acute kidney injuries are rare. They're less than 1%. So asymptomatic, but they are rare. However, there is an increased risk for ultramarathon runners, which underscores the importance of maintaining water and sodium balance during exercise. And you do this by abiding rather than outsmarting your body's regulatory mechanisms. Again, your body has a lot of redundant mechanisms aimed to regulate it by yourself. So listen to your body during this race. Good luck.
Thank you, Dr. We'll open it up for
now. We have a few more minutes left. So if could I just have Dr. Andrew Bosch and Dr. Butler? So, any
Switch on the
questions
light.
from the audience?
Switch on the light.
Anybody? Any questions? Well, yes, Bernadette.
From a couple of slides ago, Tamara, you had the athletes with high sodium intake during the race, low sodium and none, and their performance at the bottom was a line that you didn't really touch on. But the low, it was I think kilometers, and the ones with low sodium intake actually, I don't know if it was statistically significant, but that actually ran the furthest if it was running, cycling, whatever. And I remember from, that I've just glossed over somewhere in Tim Noakes' waterlogged book, a mention of the intake of electrolytes in during competition, that perhaps it's likely, oh yeah, okay, it's pointless, but perhaps it may allow increased carbohydrate metabolism. And I haven't gone into where the rest of that's coming from. Can either of you speak to that, the possibility that some electrolyte may be beneficial, as considering what was on the slide, and then the idea that it may improve carbohydrates?
I'll start. We haven't really made the link between sodium and carbohydrate. We've made the link between, I know carbohydrate will bind water, so that it would liberate a water source. We've seen also evidence that people who do take in more salt during an ultra endurance run seem to perform better, and we don't know why. So we haven't established a link between sodium intake and carbohydrate, and then performance. So we know that people who took in more sodium, they seem to finish the race than people who didn't. But again, too, in performance, if you've lost weight, if you lose between 0 to 4% of your body weight, that doesn't seem to affect performance. So again, to answer your original question, we haven't made a scientific link between how sodium will affect carbohydrate. But again, too, is it going to hurt you? It's probably not going to hurt you to take a little bit, to take the sodium beverages. It's when you start to take 10 times the amount where I think that it's going to be a problem.
I know of no particular link. I've not come across it in the literature at all. I'd go so far as to say I don't think there is. But yeah, I can't be sure. I think that if there was, we'd probably have seen some more sign of it by now. I'd rather just stick with what Tammy was saying.
Right. Anybody? Yes.
I've got a question for Dr. Bosch. You talk about kind of an optimal rate of glucose intake, or well, carbohydrate intake being something on the order of a gram per minute. Does it matter whether that's like 60 grams per hour, or 30 grams per half hour, or 120 grams per 2 hours?
No, not really, as long as you don't start too late, because you won't be able to catch up. And that's because of the rates of gastric emptying and the amount of concentration that you can ingest without impairing things and so on. So the gram a minute, if you start early on, whether you're taking it kind of like very regularly or every 20 minutes or something like that, that doesn't matter. As long as you don't wait until an hour and then try and say, okay, well, I missed 60 grams in the first hour, therefore I better start trying to make up 120 grams in the second hour, then it's not going to work. But otherwise, it's not too important. And if I could just add on to that, because it kind of links in with what Tammy was saying, that she was saying, and it could just, if you picked up on it, it could just be a kind of a conflict. That I was saying drink around about 600 mils per hour. There was a slide where I just quickly put that up. And Tammy was saying don't regulate it. Now Tammy is, I'm speaking for her, I think I'm right, is looking at it purely from a fluid point of view. And saying that, okay, you don't need all this fluid, drink according to thirst. And I don't dispute that. If that is all I was interested in, I'd say, right, that's absolutely fine. For me, what I was talking about was the fluid was a delivery mechanism for my beloved carbohydrate. Okay, so I want you to get, don't fall. I'm trying to get 60 grams of carbohydrate into your power, and the only way I can do it is in a fluid environment. If you take a 10% drink, you can do that by drinking 600 mils per hour. And Tammy can jump in on this in a moment. Although it might seem like we're conflicting each other, I don't think we really are, because if you get the 600 mils per hour, and in 99% of cases, that could be almost viewed as a starting point. And from the point of view that if you need more and you're feeling thirsty, well then drink more. But at least you've got your starting point of your 60 grams of carbohydrate from your 600 mils of fluid. And it's very, very unlikely that by drinking only 600 mils of fluid per hour that you're going to get into any of the trouble that Tammy was talking about. So you're not going to get hyponatremic by drinking 600 mils per hour. But maybe Tammy would like to just sort of jump in and confirm.
Depends on your fluid intake. I mean, it's hard to give like guidelines because some of us are 40 kilograms and some of us are 100. And to give like, oh, you need 600 mils, it's going to vary. It depends on how fast you're running as well and how cold and how hot. So it's very variable. But again, too, we're talking about two different things: the delivery of carbohydrate and how much water actually we will need. So.
The problem becomes maybe a little bit less. Tammy just quickly now said if you do 40 kilograms, I'd be willing to give that if I was dealing with a 40 kilogram athlete, I would take down the gram per minute story. It would probably be a little bit less than that. That would mean that the required fluid to deliver it would also go down. So I think once again I don't think we'd be arguing with each other.
That's an important point because I was thinking about it when Tammy was doing her lecture on what is the magic equation on percentage of electrolyte. You got so many different brands out there, but it's more preference, body weight dependent and all that stuff. So we can't pick one or the other for like a magic electrolyte drink for the athletes out there. Just a quick question for Dr. Bosch. Carbo loading. How much do you eat pasta the day before the race? What's recommended and stuff on those lines? Because I mean, carbo loading is kind of synonymous with pasta parties the day before the race. You know, I personally eat steak before the race, but I don't know. So, do you want to touch a little bit on that?
Yeah, well, you know, like you said, it's kind of like traditional to have the pasta parties the night before. You know, if you just eat that in moderation, that's absolutely fine. Where I sort of put a bit of a question mark is if you're really pigging out on the last day with trying to ingest massive amounts of carbohydrate. I think that's maybe where you get problems with GI problems during the race and so on. So if you have a modest amount, normal meal size amount of a pasta the night before, I don't have a problem with that. What I was referring to there about your carbo loading, that intense carbo loading period, which I said could be brought down to 2 days. So that would be where you're sort of trying to get 500, 600 grams of carbohydrate per day. That's where you kind of like constantly feel that you're like pigging out and you don't want to eat all that amount of carbohydrate. That's what I'm saying. Cut that down on the last day and just eat like you normally do, and that will still include being able to go and have a pasta supplement, for instance. So I don't have a problem with that.
Yes, Alfonso.
I have a more general question to the carbohydrate metabolism. As far as I know, most studies are actually done only for, let's say, shorter distances or durations, 2 hours, maybe a marathon. It's probably tough to find 24-hour volunteers. How much of the, let's say, conventional wisdom on carbohydrate, especially muscle glycogen depletion and so carries on, in your opinion, onto real long ultra marathon run?
That's a good question. And you're quite right. It's certainly very difficult to get somebody to do something for 24 hours in the laboratory, and maybe you'll get 1 or 2 people who are mad enough to do it, but you're not going to get a nice sample size. In our lab, I think we, more than others, have managed to get quite big sample sizes for up to 6 hours, and everything pretty much holds true for 6 hours. I think it's one of these cases where it's like educated guessing, you know. You're going to also have to learn from what you can from real situations of people running these things or cyclists cycling these really long duration things. Certainly, in a 100-mile athlete that I worked with once, I applied all stuff that I was talking about here, and it's certainly applied in that case. I know that, for instance, in 100-milers, most people like to eat. I didn't see a need for eating. I said the reason that you want to eat during a 100-mile race is because you're not looking after your fluid-delivered carbohydrate and protein needs adequately. And in this particular race, I try to do what I consider optimal in terms of carbohydrate and protein drinks during the race. She certainly did not feel hungry at all. This is a female athlete in the 100 miler. She didn't feel hungry at all. And she did it in just over 15 hours, which is not a bad time for a female for 100 miles. And she felt absolutely fine the whole time. The only other additional stuff that she felt like was coffee during the night. And the rest of that was carbohydrate drinks with some protein in. So I'm saying that is because that's getting kind of long. It's n equals 1, so I don't know if it holds true. If I was working with a 24-hour runner, I would start with these basic principles, and I would tell the runner that you're going to be an experimental case, and we're just going to have to work out. Let's start with this, apply what we know, and let's see what works, and we'll take feedback. And did you feel this? Did you feel that? Did this happen? Did something else happen? And then modify it for the next time. So it'll be a learning process.
Time for one last question. Anybody? Yes, sir.
I've got a question for Dr. Yu. The concept of the craving salt when you're depleted holds true for sodium. Is there any evidence that would hold true for potassium as well, or?
I don't think that you don't need the potassium because potassium is intracellular, especially if you're muscle breakdown, you'll actually. So in terms of craving potassium, I don't know of any studies, but again, seem to be bananas and tomatoes. So, but I think your body really knows what it was, and I think that's underdeveloped in the scientific world.
Oftentimes the blood potassium is actually going up during exercise. So maybe the last thing you want to do is go and add yet more potassium in. It might actually be a case of the body's got enough to deal with as it is. It's trying to regulate potassium maybe. Blood potassium is going the opposite direction to where it's wanting to go. So maybe it's trying to bring it back down. And now you're adding more in, you might just be making a bad situation worse.
Right, perfect.
And magnesium?
That brings out a funny, we had actually a case report from comrades, and so these 4 runners were taking cramp block, which is magnesium, calcium, sodium, and potassium, and they all went into renal failure. So, you have to be really careful about the other electrolytes.
Also,
Yeah, so,
causing some problems.
right.
Okay, all right, thank you. I mean, ultrarunning is like based on volunteers, as we have seen. You will see a lot of volunteers tomorrow in the race, and Dr. Hugh Butler and Dr. Bosch volunteered their time to come from South Africa and the United States to speak to all of us about ultrarunning. I think it's very important. It's on the up. The ultrarunning is going on an upswing right now, and you'll see a lot more research done, a lot more papers being published, a lot more scrutiny about what this sport is all about. So, as a token of our appreciation, I was going to ask Peter to come up too, and he's got a phone. So, Peter Zuckerbuck is the race director of and the chief of the LSU over here. So, we have a little bit of a token of our appreciation from the region over here for Dr. Bosch and Dr. Butler. So,
Thank you. If I can add, if there are adverse events, just share them. I mean, I think that we need to know of certain things that may happen.
Tammy's always trying to recruit.
Yeah.
And you're smart. Oh, you're smart. One more, okay?